Right now you're looking at a screen. Maybe it's your phone. Maybe it's a laptop. And somewhere nearby there are people. Your neighbors are arguing, or watching TV, or cooking dinner. Outside, someone just honked a horn. A delivery truck is idling. A dog is barking 3 streets away. You're surrounded by humanity so completely, so constantly that you've stopped noticing it. It's just background noise. Now imagine you wake up tomorrow, and all of it is gone. Not a natural disaster. No rubble. No wreckage. The streets are completely clean. The cars are parked exactly where they were left. The food in grocery stores is still fresh. The lights are still on. Everything is perfectly in place, except for the people. Every single one of them. Gone. 8 billion human beings, and every single one simply vanished, except you, and maybe a few others. If you're watching this channel for the first time, subscribe right now because this is what we do here. We ask the questions that rewrite how you see the world. And this one might be the most unsettling we've ever explored, because here's what nobody tells you when they run this thought experiment. The real question isn't whether you could survive. The real question is what happens to the version of you that's left behind. And the answer changes everything you think you know about civilization, meaning, and what human beings actually are. Let's start with the first 72 hours, because that's when the first myth dies. The myth is this: if civilization collapsed, most people would starve. You've probably thought this. You're not wrong to think it. We are spectacularly dependent on systems we don't understand. The food in your fridge came from a supply chain involving hundreds of trucks, hundreds of workers, dozens of processing plants. The water in your tap flows through a system of pumps and treatment facilities running 24 hours a day, every day. But here's the truth. A single Walmart supercenter contains enough non-perishable food to keep a group of 20 people alive for over 2 years. A single medium-sized grocery store has enough canned goods alone to sustain a small family for decades if rationed correctly. The industrialized world is buried under mountains of preserved food that nobody would be competing for anymore. In the first week, food is not your problem. Water is. But even that has solutions. Urban environments are surrounded by rivers, lakes, and reservoirs. Rain collection is primitive to build. A basic solar still can purify contaminated water in hours. Filtration systems exist in nearly every sporting goods store, already assembled, already waiting on a shelf. First aid manuals, medical reference books, pharmaceutical stockpiles, all of it sits untouched. In week 1, the bigger issue isn't survival technology. It's this: the power grid goes dark. Modern electrical grids need constant human management. Without engineers monitoring load balance, without maintenance crews, without operators at switching stations, the grid fails within 3 to 7 days. Most estimates put widespread blackouts closer to 72 hours. And that's when things get genuinely serious. Because nuclear power plants don't just turn off, they need active cooling. Without human operators, most facilities can run on backup generators for about 2 weeks. After that, the fuel rods begin to overheat. Radioactive material starts to leak. Chernobyl didn't happen because of an explosion alone. It happened because of a loss of control. Now imagine every operational nuclear plant on Earth, around 440 of them losing their operators simultaneously. That's 440 potential Chernobyls. Not all of them would melt down. Modern designs have passive cooling systems built to run for weeks without human input, but many wouldn't. Within a month, the air around dozens of facilities on every continent would carry fallout. Contaminated runoff would reach rivers and coastlines. The ocean, which already absorbs around a third of everything we emit, would begin absorbing something far worse. This is the first real twist of the scenario, and it's not what most people expect. The danger isn't from what you'd have to compete for. It's from what we built, the infrastructure of civilization itself, turning against us the moment we step away. But here's what I want you to sit with, because this is where the scenario stops being about survival skills and starts being about something far more interesting. Let's say you figure it out. You find food and water. You learn to generate power with solar panels. You identify and avoid the contaminated zones. You adapt. Humans always adapt. That's literally what we're best at. Now what? Because here's the thing that the survivalists and the preppers and the apocalypse fantasy genre never really address. The moment you've secured your basic needs, you're left with something that is potentially more dangerous than any of the threats we just walked through. Something that doesn't have a solution in any manual. Something that no amount of canned food or solar panels can fix. You're left with silence. And science knows exactly what that silence does to the human mind. The answer doesn't just change the thought experiment. It changes what you understand about what human beings fundamentally are. In 1973, Austrian survival expert Rüdiger Neberg attempted to live in complete isolation in the wilderness. He was physically capable. He had food, he had water, he had shelter. He lasted less than 2 weeks before the psychological deterioration became dangerous. Not because of the conditions, because of the silence. He's not an outlier. NASA has been studying isolation since the 1960s for an obvious reason. You cannot send astronauts to Mars an 18-month round trip without understanding what prolonged near solitude does to a human brain. What they found is that isolation doesn't just make people sad or anxious, it restructures the brain itself. Prolonged isolation causes measurable changes to the prefrontal cortex, the area governing decision-making, emotional regulation, and identity. The hippocampus, which handles memory and spatial awareness, begins to shrink under sensory deprivation. And critically, the brain starts generating its own stimulation, because stimulation, it turns out, is not a luxury for humans. It is a biological need as fundamental as food. Without external input, the brain fills the silence, with voices, with patterns in random noise, with faces in shadows, with presences in empty rooms. The clinical term is perceptual distortion. Most people know it by a different name. They call it losing your mind. But here's where the research becomes historically strange. We know from the diaries, journals, and memoirs of people who have survived true isolation, shipwreck survivors, prisoners in solitary confinement, Antarctic explorers stranded for months, that one of the most consistent documented experiences is a sudden, overwhelming need to create, to build, to draw, to write, to make marks on whatever surface is available, to talk to objects, to name things, to tell stories to no one. Ernest Shackleton's men, stranded on the ice of Antarctica for nearly 2 years after their ship was crushed in pack ice, documented an obsessive urge to create structure and narrative even when the situation appeared hopeless. They organized theatrical performances on the ice. They held formal debates. They wrote and hand-illustrated a ship newspaper called the Aurora Australis, assembled from scraps of paper while they were starving to death at the bottom of the world. This is not a quirk of psychology. This is the core of what humans are. We are meaning-making machines. We don't just survive, we narrate. We organize experience into story. We look for patterns in chaos. We build internal worlds out of nothing. Not because it helps us survive, but because survival alone is not what we were designed for. And this brings us to the deepest question the scenario raises. If you were among the last humans on Earth, what would you do with the knowledge? With everything our species ever built, ever wrote, ever discovered, ever created, sitting there, accessible, intact, but meaningful only to you? Here's where the thought experiment stops being philosophical and starts being almost physically painful, because the world doesn't wait while you figure it out. Within 1 year of humanity disappearing, nature begins its reclamation, and it is not slow. It is shockingly, almost violently fast. The first thing to go is the roads. Not physically, not yet, but weeds find every crack almost immediately. Dandelions and grasses push through asphalt with extraordinary force. Root systems that were always there, always held at bay by maintenance crews, expand the moment the pressure lifts. Within 2 years, entire city streets look like they've been abandoned for a decade. Within 10 years, most cities in tropical and subtropical regions, Miami, Bangkok, São Paulo, are partially consumed by vegetation. Skyscrapers still stand, glass and steel hold, but their lower floors are wrapped in vines. Their lobbies colonized by saplings pushing through the floor tiles. Wildlife that was pushed to the margins for centuries comes flooding back. Wolves return to Western Europe within years, not decades, because wolf populations in Eastern Europe have been waiting just outside the boundary of human civilization this whole time, watching. Within 100 years, most wooden structures have rotted away entirely. Houses in rural areas have collapsed. The skeletal remains of cities built before reinforced concrete have largely merged with the soil. Only the great stone engineering projects survive. The pyramids, the Roman aqueducts, the medieval cathedrals, the things we carved into rock, those endure. But here's the detail nobody thinks about when they run this scenario. 200 years after humanity disappears, something happens in the sky. Our satellites begin to fall. There are roughly 8,000 satellites in orbit right now. Some exist in geostationary orbit at 36,000 kilometers. Up there, atmospheric drag is negligible, and they'll remain in orbit for millions of years. But the vast majority of functional satellites, the ones carrying phone signals, GPS positioning, internet data, weather monitoring, exist in low Earth orbit, where atmospheric drag is constant and small but relentless. Without human engineers making continuous micro-corrections, most low-orbit satellites decay and fall within 5 to 25 years. Within 200 years, the sky is as empty of human technology as it was before Sputnik launched in 1957. Every photograph ever uploaded, every film ever digitized, every piece of music ever recorded and stored on a server somewhere. All of it slowly degrading on hard drives with no power source, in data centers with no cooling, in buildings being consumed by roots and rain. The entire digital record of human civilization, which we've trusted completely, which we've assumed would last forever, is effectively erased within a few generations. What survives? Stone, fired clay, carved bone, the same things that survived every other lost civilization before ours. The Library of Alexandria burned, but the hieroglyphics carved into temple walls in Luxor are still completely readable today, 4,000 years later. The things we wrote in stone, those remain. And this is where the thought experiment stops being a thought experiment and becomes something else entirely. Let's close every loop we opened. You wake up tomorrow, the world is empty. You secure food, water, shelter. You navigate the blackouts and the contamination zones. You adapt, because humans always adapt. You survive the silence, or at least you try to. And then slowly, you start to realize what you're holding. You are the custodian of everything. Every library on Earth is open to you, every museum, every archive, every university, hospital, observatory, every place where human beings spent centuries collecting and organizing what they'd learned about the universe. You can walk into the Vatican archives. You can walk through the Louvre with no crowds, no closing time, no glass between you and the art. You can read the original manuscripts of Newton's Principia. You can drive to the Atacama Desert, where the largest concentration of astronomical telescopes on the planet sit perfectly intact, and look at the universe through instruments that cost billions of dollars and took decades to build. Nobody is going to stop you. But here's the question philosophers have been circling for decades. What is the point? Aristotle argued that humans are political animals, not political in the modern sense, not parties and elections. Political in the original Greek sense, we are creatures of the polis, the community, the shared space. We don't just live alongside others, we require others to be fully ourselves. Language only exists because of community, meaning only exists in relation to other minds. Even the concept of beauty only exists because another person can recognize it. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein argued that a truly private language, a language spoken and understood by only one person, is a logical impossibility. Language by its very nature requires a community of speakers to give words their meaning. If you say this is beautiful, and there is no one to agree or disagree, what have you said? If you're the last human, what does the word beautiful mean? What does courage mean? What does justice mean? Are these concepts that exist in the world independent of us, or are they agreements between minds? And if they're agreements, what happens when there's only one mind left to agree? Researchers and philosophers who have studied this scenario seriously have found something consistently striking. When people truly imagine it, not as an action movie fantasy of freedom, but as a reality of permanent solitude, the thing they mourn is not food or electricity or the internet. It's not even specific people they love, though that comes close. The thing they miss most is being known, being witnessed, having another person look at them and recognize that they exist, that their experience of the world is real and matters and is worth something. We are not just meaning-making machines. We are meaning-sharing machines. And without someone to share with, the mechanism begins to break. You're looking at a screen right now. Somewhere nearby, there are people probably irritating you in some small way. Someone's music is too loud. Traffic is building up outside. Your upstairs neighbor walks like they're trying to leave footprints in concrete. And everything about modern life is architected to make you feel like other people are the obstacle. Like what you need is more time alone, more space, less noise, less friction. But here's what every isolation experiment, every shipwreck diary, every polar expedition memoir, and every philosopher who has ever seriously engaged with this question has concluded. The friction is the point. Other people are not an obstacle to your life. They are the condition of it. Everything you have ever wanted, love, recognition, meaning, achievement, even the deep private pleasure of thinking a thought so clearly that you could explain it to someone else, all of it depends on the existence of other minds. We traded thousands of years of genuine, physical, around-the-fire community for a screen, and we've become so saturated with simulated connection that we've forgotten what real connection actually costs, which is proximity, and vulnerability, and time, and the willingness to be known by someone who might also sometimes be mildly infuriating. The last human wouldn't be standing in an empty world relieved by the quiet. They'd be standing there in the ruins of the Louvre, or under the Milky Way with no light pollution for the first time in centuries, or on an empty beach with the whole Atlantic to themselves, and they'd be wishing they had paid more attention to the people who were there. Not to their phones, not to their feeds, to the people. And most of us don't figure that out until it's too late. If this video made you see something differently about silence, about other people, about what you'd actually lose if the world went quiet, subscribe. That's what this channel is for. Not the questions with clean answers. The ones that follow you out of the video and into your actual day. The ones that change what you notice. We put one of these out every single week. You already know where the button is.